Okay, today we're diving into another hot topic in New Testament studies. Who wrote the Gospel of John? And for some of you who maybe grew up in Christian circles, in evangelical circles, this may sound like a dumb question because you're like, well, it's got a title. Obviously, it was written by John. It's not quite as simple as that. It has been hotly debated in New Testament studies, and every sort of argument against it and criticism against John the Apostle being the author of the Gospel of John has been set forth. And so what I want to do in this video today is I want to explore the external evidence, the internal evidence, and arguments against John the Apostle being the author of this fourth gospel, and just kind of explore holistically the arguments that have been taking place up to this point. So it's going to be probably the most up-to-date information on scholarship that you could have from the perspective of John the Apostle being the author of the fourth gospel. And so the reason I'm doing this is because I'm preparing for a PhD entrance exam into New Testament studies, and these are the types of topics that I have to have down really well. And I also find it interesting, and so maybe you will too. And so I'm just recording it, and it's helping me learn it better than if I just read it. So it's been fun so far, and I'm going to do this for most of the books of the Bible and a bunch of other New Testament topics in order to prep for the entrance exam in a couple months. So pretty excited. But before I get into all that, let me just define a few terms real quick. External evidence. It's basically the evidence for the Apostle John's authorship outside of the text of the book of John. Internal evidence is the opposite. It's the breadcrumbs that we find within the gospel itself of who might be the author, because it's formally anonymous. So nowhere in the book does it say, I, the Apostle John, wrote this book, blah, 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 blah. So we have to infer it. Now, John comes the closest of any of the gospels to saying that, and we're going to discuss that in a bit. But that's internal evidence. And then three other terms. The Apostle John, when I say the Apostle John, I'm referring to John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 from the Synoptics. So he's one of the 12 disciples. He became an apostle, and he has been known as such since. But there's two other terms that are important. The beloved disciple, which is a title for I'll say it now, an unknown disciple in the latter half of John's gospel. So from chapter 13 on, it begins to mention this beloved disciple. And then third, you have the evangelist. And when I say the evangelist, that's synonymous with the author of the fourth gospel, because people will often shorthand it and just say evangelist because the author of the fourth gospel is a mouthful. So when I say evangelist, beloved disciple, and John the Apostle, even though I believe those three indicators are one and the same person, not everyone believes that. And we're going to get into all those arguments in this video. But it's just worth noting now that I think they're the same person, but a lot of people will say, oh, the evangelist, John the Apostle, and the beloved disciple are three different people, or two of them are the same and one of them is different, or every mix that you can think of, right? So with all those disclaimers, let's get into starting with the external evidence. Can we know from the external evidence that John the Apostle is the evangelist? Remember, evangelist being the author of the fourth gospel. And when I talk about external evidence, I always have to start with the title. Even though it's not an open and shut case with the title, it is still strong evidence. Some people want to say, oh, the titles were added later in around 125 AD when the four gospels came together as the fourfold gospel, circulated in a codex, also known as a book, and they circulated as the fourfold gospel, singular gospel, and so they had to have different names attached so that people knew, oh, which part of the gospel is this coming? Who's this gospel according to? Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? And so they were all together as a codex. Unfortunately, this is just pure conjecture. There is no evidence at all that the four gospels were given titles at this point in time. We don't even know when the four gospels started circulating together. That in itself is a conjecture. It's a guess, like we don't know. And so then to build on top of that guess and say, oh yeah, that's also when the titles were added, it's just pure speculation. There is no evidence for that. What we do have evidence for is that every manuscript that we have in existence has the title attached to it. So every manuscript we have of the Gospel of John, where we have the beginning of the gospel, some we don't because decay and being destroyed or things like that, weather issues with the papyri or the animal skins. So we don't have the beginning. But every manuscript that we have the beginning of, it has according to John at the beginning. There's no evidence that it was added later. The other point with titles being added later is if they were added at a later date, you would expect some more variation. You wouldn't expect all of a sudden they appear 50 years after the books were written on a bunch of different manuscripts that are all the same. You would expect variation of like, oh, maybe it's attributed to John here, it's attributed to Philip here, something like that. But we don't see that. We have complete consistency, which shows a common source, the beginning, when it was written. So even though they're formally anonymous, I do strongly believe that the titles were attached to the Gospels from the very beginning. We have no hard evidence to the contrary. We only have conjecture, speculation, and guesswork. Enough on that. I've said that in 4 videos now. Hopefully I never have to say it again. I'm getting tired of repeating it. but it's really important. It's a really important argument to make because people just want to say, oh, the title was added later, and they leave it at that. And I'm like, you can't just leave it at that and just say that with no evidence, because there is no evidence. So anyway, so after that, so the first surviving evidence that we have of someone quoting John the Apostle as the author of the book of John is from 181, and that's from, what is his name? From Theophilus of Antioch. That's in 181. He clearly states, yes, the Apostle John wrote it. And then we also have Irenaeus in the 180s. He explicitly says that John the Apostle is the evangelist. And the reason, again, that Irenaeus is so important is because he was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of the Apostle John. And so when Irenaeus is writing, and when he is discussing these things, he is pulling from multiple sources. He has Polycarp, who was a contemporary of when John was writing. That's why it's so important, is especially when thinking of the Gospel of John, Polycarp was alive and with John during the time that John was writing, in the 80s, 90s timeframe. And so Polycarp is telling Irenaeus, yes, I was with John. I knew John the Apostle, and he claimed to be an eyewitness, and he claimed to have written the 4th gospel. And that's what Irenaeus is writing about. So a lot of people want to make a big deal. Oh, Irenaeus was writing in 180. That's 100 years. That's 80 years after the Gospel of John was written. So we can't possibly know if it's trustworthy. But when you see the direct line of succession of this information, it shrinks that time frame all the way back to the time that John was actually alive. So it's not outdated information. It's actually really fresh, and it's the most relevant information possible. Far more relevant than guesswork from people in the 21st century who want to deny the claim that John wrote the 4th gospel. This is the most historically valuable information we could probably have. And that's not to mention the other sources that Irenaeus is using. He has 3 other sources. He has Scripture itself. So he's got Polycarp, he's got Scripture itself, he's got Papias, and then he's got someone he calls the Elder, which is an unnamed 2nd generation Christian. We're not sure who he is, but Irenaeus quotes him a lot, and we know that Irenaeus finds him equally reliable to people like Papias and Polycarp. And so we're fairly certain that he's a 2nd generation Christian who knew the eyewitnesses and the disciples of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. So besides Irenaeus, we also have Clement of Alexandria, and we have Tertullian. Both are 2nd century witnesses to John the Apostle being the evangelist. And then last, we have the anti-Marcionite prologue to the Gospel of John. This claims 2 really important things. One, it claims that John the Apostle is the author, which is what we're looking at, but it also claims that Papias is the one who makes that claim. So we don't have any writings of Papias directly that claims that John is the evangelist, but the anti-Marcionite prologue tells us that in his 5-volume work that we just don't have anymore, it's no longer extant, but the anti-Marcionite prologue says Papias claimed that John was the evangelist in his 5-volume work. So it's a bummer that we don't have that, but we do have attestation that says he did claim that. And again, Papias was writing in around 110 or 130, but he was also someone who he said he was around when John was still alive and bearing witness to the gospel story. And so we have information, secondhand information, going right back to the time period that John was actually writing his gospel. Now, there's a few pieces of indirect evidence. That was all very direct data points of mentioning of John's authorship somewhere in history. We have some indirect evidence as well that's pretty helpful. For one, Tatian was writing, he wanted to put together a gospel harmony. So he harmonized all 4 of the gospel stories into one longer story. And in 170, he used John as the structure, as kind of the timeline. It was the foundation of the 4 gospels. And we have to ask ourselves, if Tatian had any doubt on who was the author of the 4th gospel, would he have used it as the foundation for the 4 gospels? Absolutely not. So this tells us that we can infer from this that Tatian believed that John the Apostle, the eyewitness to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, was the author of this 4th gospel. And so therefore he felt like he could use it as the foundation, as the structure of his entire gospel, harmony. So he never explicitly states John the apostle, the beloved disciple, is the one who wrote the fourth gospel, but we can infer that's what he believed based on how he used the book. Now, there are a handful of people who rejected John, the gospel according to John completely as not scripture, but they did it for very, very specific reasons that no one else affirmed, right? It was this very small group of people. One well-known example is a guy named Gaius, and he rejected John's gospel because he was actively refuting a cult movement in early Christianity called Montanism, led by Montanus, and Montanus claimed to be the mouthpiece of the Holy Spirit. And so there's a lot of teaching on the Paraclete in the Gospel of John. And so in order to combat this heresy, Gaius, he denounced the Gospel of John and Revelation. But he's clearly biased, right? He clearly had a bone to pick with this Montanus figure, and so he wasn't making that claim based on any historical reasons, but rather because of a heresy that he was trying to combat. So that's the only part of the external evidence that would push against the idea that the Apostle John wrote the fourth gospel. And lastly, we have Eusebius's testimony, and this is important for two reasons. One, in one place he says, yes, John the Apostle is the evangelist, but in another place, he is talking about all of the doubtful cases in the New Testament, all of the disputed books of the New Testament, for example. There were some extra books in the New Testament up until the 4th century that were, quote, disputed, and even like James was disputed, Revelation was disputed for a lot longer and Hebrews was disputed because, well, Hebrews, for one thing, it was genuinely anonymous. Like no one knew who wrote it for sure. And so that was disputed for a while because of its lack of authorship, which is actually an argument for John's authorship because Hebrews is truly anonymous, and so it was disputed for longer. James, because of its apparent contradiction with Paul, which really isn't a contradiction, but on surface level it looks like a contradiction, and so that was disputed for a while. And then Revelation, just because it's so weird, right? Like we can all say that Revelation is a weird book, very apocalyptic, hard to read. And so these were debated a little bit longer. So Eusebius, he's reflecting on it, he's discussing all of these debated cases. John is never mentioned as a debated New Testament book. Is it in the canon? Is it out of the canon? And so that's really important because that shows us that Eusebius, with all of his sources, he had a ton of sources that we don't have access to today. And in all the stuff that he's reading and writing about, never once does he find the Gospel of John as a debated case for should it be in the canon, who wrote it, etc. So open and shut case for him. Lastly, normally I mention Papias first, but I have to mention him at the end here because it's an interesting case. So Papias is the reason that a lot of people want to claim that there are two Johns. There's John the Apostle and John the Elder. I haven't mentioned that yet in this video, but that's what people claim. And when I get to the internal evidence, you'll understand who the beloved disciple is. But it's popular in today's circles for people to say, oh, it's John the Elder, not John the Apostle, who is equal to the beloved disciple, and that's the author, not John the Apostle. So John the Apostle is one person, and then the beloved disciple and the evangelist and John the Elder, that's another person. That started with a quote from Papias and really just a misunderstanding of Papias's quote. So let me read it. I'll put it on the screen as well. And if anyone chanced to come who had actually been a follower of the elders, I would inquire as to the discourses of the elders, what Andrew or what Peter said, or what Philip or what Thomas or James or what John or Matthew or any other of the Lord's disciples said, and things which Aristion and John the Elder, disciples of the Lord, say. So this is interesting because what people want, if you see, I highlighted the verbs, said and say. Said is past tense, say is present tense. So what people want to say is, look, said, anytime said is attributed to the followers of the Lord, the elders. I've bolded the elders. So I bolded the elders. The elders is in purple. The verbs are in yellow. So all of these elders who said things in the past are first generation disciples, apostles. This is what some people want to say. And then all the people who are still saying, a present tense say, they are second generation Christians. The problem with this is that the attribution of the elders in the first part is to apostles. And then we have elder again qualifying John. And so what this tells us is actually said and say is not first generation versus second generation. It's those It's the first generation Christians who witnessed the Lord and already passed away. And then say is those who witnessed the Lord but are still alive today. And people want to say, oh, John the Elder has to be someone different because that's weird. Why would you repeat that? But it's actually better if we say the aforementioned John the Elder, the one who's already been mentioned, because he's still alive. It makes much more sense when you've already called the apostles elders once, and then to clarify, oh, I'm still talking about John the Elder because he's still alive, so you call him an elder again. We do that all the time in English. We just use different words. And in another video, I've already talked that Papias is a little clunky with his words anyways, and so it makes sense that this is what he says, even if it's not the most crisp grammar or the most crisp writing style, it still makes the most sense instead of making up some other John the Elder that has no other attestation in the external evidence. So and a couple other points on that. One, elders and apostles are also equated in 1 Peter 5:1, so that's got precedence. And then in 3 John, John calls himself John the Elder. And so we have clear examples in the text of the apostle John calling himself John, and then of Peter calling the apostles elders. And so there is no problem with Papias's use of the term elder here to refer to apostles. Okay, that's all the external evidence. Those are the main data points and the main arguments for the apostle John being the evangelist. Now, when we get into the internal evidence, we are going to hone in on the beloved disciple, and how that relates to this argument, because the beloved disciple is the only one mentioned in John who should be seen as the author, and so we have to connect the beloved disciple to the apostle John, and I think it's fairly easy to do that. So first, let's look at where the beloved disciple is explicitly mentioned. First, he's mentioned at the Last Supper in chapter 13, verse 23, and that's he is the individual who is leaning against Jesus during the meal. Next, at the cross, when Jesus commissions a disciple to take care of his mother Mary, that's the beloved disciple as well. Third, the beloved disciple makes it to the tomb faster than Peter, so he apparently has a better 40 time than Peter. And then the last time is in chapter 21. He's mentioned twice because he's in that whole narrative. He's mentioned when Jesus appears to the disciples for the third time. There's 7 disciples in that instance, and it's only disciples. Only 7 of the 12 disciples. And then at the very end of that chapter, the claim of the book is that the beloved disciple is the one who testifies to these things and has written these things. So clearly a claim of authorship. So now I want to show you 2 things based on these points of data. 1, John the Apostle is the beloved disciple, and 2, the beloved disciple is the one who wrote the 4th gospel. First, all of the synoptics, when they talk about the Last Supper, they all mention that only the 12 were present. Only the 12 disciples, no one else. So that already narrows the window of who the beloved disciple could be, because remember, the beloved disciple is the one who leaned on Jesus. So it has to be one of the 12. Second, in chapter 1, like I said, there's only 7 disciples. 3 are named. I believe it's Peter, Thomas, and Nathaniel, maybe. And then 4 unnamed. 2 of them are the sons of Zebedee, and 2 of them are completely unnamed. And we know it couldn't have been James, because James had already been martyred by the time that the Gospel of John was written. So now we have 3 possibilities. We have 2 completely unnamed disciples, or the other son of Zebedee, which is John, the apostle. Third, we see the relationship with Peter and Jesus. John had a very clear relationship with Peter. He was close to Peter in the synoptics, and so it would make sense for instances where like him and Peter running to the tomb together, that would be John. Also, he was in Jesus's inner circle. And so if Jesus were going to commission someone to take care of Mary, it most likely would have been someone from his inner 3. And again, James has already passed away at that point, so it couldn't have been James, and it's not Peter, because Peter is mentioned by name in the Gospel of John. And last, James and John are the only 2 apostles never mentioned by name in the Gospel of John. And so if we see the beloved disciple, this phrase, this title, as a substitute for a name, then it could only match one of them. And again, James has already passed away. He's already been martyred. And so it has to be the apostle John. So when you look at the internal evidence alone, it really is an open and shut case, which is kind of the opposite of the synoptic gospels, which the synoptic gospels, the external evidence is really strong and the internal evidence not as strong. In this case, the external evidence is really strong, but not as strong as the internal evidence, which is, in my mind, an open and shut case. The only qualification is if you don't trust the history of the synoptic gospels, but especially in these things like only the 12 were at the Last Supper, there is no reason to doubt that claim unless you just want to be doubtful to be doubtful. You just want to be skeptical because you just don't want to believe. It's either go with the historical data or just go with your whims and say, oh, I don't want to believe it because I don't want to believe it. Those are kind of the only two options. There are some alternatives that people postulate, but again, they're just doing guesswork instead of taking the historical data seriously. Some will say Lazarus or the rich young ruler, because in both those cases, the Gospels state that Jesus loved them. So like Jesus loved Lazarus or Jesus loved the rich young ruler. And so they're like, oh, well, it's that same title. So one of these two must be the beloved disciple. But again, compared to all the internal and external evidence for the Apostle John, this is barely even considered evidence. So why would they think that's a stronger argument than the Apostle John being the author? I'm not sure. And then the last one, some people want to say it was the beloved disciple is actually the host of the upper room where the Last Supper happened. But again, the synoptics all said only the 12 disciples were there. And so that would exclude all three of these other people. And so really what they're doing is they're making guesswork. They're saying, oh, the Gospels aren't reliable, and we think it might be these people. But especially in this specific instance, there's no reason to doubt that there were more than just the 12 at the Last Supper. Okay, that's all the external and internal evidence related to the apostleship of the Gospel of John. Now, let's look at some of the biggest critiques, some of the biggest arguments against his authorship, and see if they make any sense at all. Okay, first, some people, they want to say that a Galilean like John wouldn't have written so much of his gospel from the perspective of being in Judea, but they forget that John would have been writing 40, 50 years after his time in Galilee. So there's no reason to believe that he wouldn't have emphasized the place where he stayed longer or emphasized some other aspect of Jesus' ministry, because he hadn't lived there for decades. So there's no barrier to John being the author based on an argument like that. Some people want to call John illiterate based on Acts 4:13, where it says that they were unlearned men or something like that. But all this term means is untrained laymen. It doesn't mean that they were uneducated in any way, because the standard practice for Jews in that time was to educate their children until at least 12 years old. So Jews in general could read and write. And also, after the church's founding, and then the 12 apostles, these 11 apostles minus Judas plus Matthias, became the leaders of the early church, why would they not continue their education? They would almost certainly, because now they're teaching, they're preaching, they're constantly, and they're trying to tie Jesus back to the Old Testament. So they would have been reading more and more, and certainly writing more than what we have of them. Why would they not have continued their education and got better? Like, John could have improved his writing and his thinking and his learning over the next 50 years. We all do that. Why would we assume that who he was at the beginning of his life or at the beginning of when he started following Jesus, he remained that exact same person over the next 50 years? That, again, that's a baseless claim. It would make far more sense to say he would have improved in his reading, writing, and rhetorical abilities over that time, because he was a leader of the early church, and leaders who are teaching and things like that are just pressed to learn. It's just the nature of leadership and of teaching. Some people also want to claim that John was racist, that he had a bone to pick with Samaritans, and so he would have never written a story like what is found in John 4 with the woman at the well, where Jesus reveals his messiahship to a Samaritan woman before anyone else in all of the gospel accounts. But one, again, this is just denying the ability for people to change. This has been 50 years. The gospel, the idea that we are all forgiven in Christ and we are all one in Christ, we're united by one spirit. This would have been working on him for years and decades. Why could he not have changed his tune? Like that's actually a primary purpose of the gospel in the book of Ephesians, is like the gospel cures racism, because it shows that we're all equal. We're all at the same level. We're all guilty, but we're all forgiven. And so there's just no reason to believe that John couldn't have written that chapter. Some also want to argue that Galileans could not speak Greek, but that's, again, that there isn't historical data to support that. It was more than likely that everyone in that region was bilingual. Probably the most frequently cited critique is that John would never have called himself the beloved disciple. Like, that's the height of pride, the height of hubris. Why would you call yourself the beloved disciple in comparison to other disciples? But that argument actually refutes itself, because if John is making that claim himself, it's actually it's a way to remain anonymous. But then also to express this very Christian idea that he is loved by Jesus. Now think of it on the flip side. If someone else were writing this gospel, then they would be claiming that John was loved more than other disciples. But that's not what John is claiming. He's just claiming that he has experienced the love of Jesus. And so he's inserting himself into the story by calling himself the beloved disciple, which is a very common rhetorical device to speak of yourself in the third person. And this is a very Eastern culture thing. I use this example in another video. When I was in China studying Chinese, my Chinese teacher would always refer to herself in the third person as Lao Shi. She would not say me or I, like with the wo. She would always say teacher, teacher this, teacher that in the third person. And it's a form of humility that you're not referring to yourself as me, but in the third person. It's a very common rhetorical device. He would have been doing that exact same thing here as well. So it's much harder to believe that someone else would call John the beloved disciple instead of he himself calling him that. And then again, if John the apostle wasn't writing, then why name every single other disciple in the Gospel of John except for John? That doesn't really make any sense. But by not naming himself, he actually singles himself out as the author. Some people also want to say that in chapter 1, the beloved disciple is only saying that he wrote these things, these last few chapters, as an eyewitness, but he wasn't writing the whole gospel as an eyewitness account. But then why did he start showing up in chapter 13? That doesn't make sense. So he's been an eyewitness since chapter 13 at least. And the reason he likely didn't mention himself previous to chapter 13 is because in like Luke and in the synoptic gospels, John is not painted in the best light. And so those stories would have already circulated wide. And so John didn't necessarily want to give that any more publicity. He wanted to show what the gospel had done to change him in the latter half of the gospel when he was full of faith, where the synoptics really paint him with his lack of faith, which is also true. John wanted to highlight, well, here's how I've changed. And so he doesn't show up until the second half of the gospel to highlight that aspect of his life. Some also want to claim that John wouldn't make himself look better than Peter in his gospel, but there is not competition happening. People want to say, oh, look, John made it to the tomb before Peter, so he's bragging. And it's like, no, he's not doing that at all, because Peter entered the tomb first, right? So John sat outside and he was trepidatious. He was scared. Peter went right into the tomb. And then when John says that he saw and believed, he never says that Peter didn't believe. So people want to make a mountain out of a molehill and say, look, there's this jockeying between Peter and John. And if you actually read the text closely, there is none of that at all. Next, some people want to say that the Gospel of John was actually written by a community. It wasn't written by an individual, that it was like this Johannine community or this Johannine school that they had learned from John. And then as a community, they crafted this gospel based on different writings or different aspects of what John had taught. And the reason this just doesn't work out is because the Gospel of John has seamless Greek. Like it is a seamless unity of writing. It's not a disparate collection of different teachings or whatever of the Apostle John. And so that just doesn't work. A better question is actually, why does Jesus sound so much like John? Like it's such a seamless work of literature that people have made the claim that actually Jesus kind of sounds like John. It doesn't really sound like a direct quotation of Jesus, because whenever Jesus is speaking, he's using all of the same verbiage and the same prepositions and this kind of style, this Greek style that John has in his other narrative sections. So is John even quoting Jesus? That's a better question. The Johannine school theory is just out because it's too seamless. It is a single literary work done by an individual, not a hodgepodge mishmash of different writings. But the best question is, why does Jesus sound like John instead of being quoted from Jesus directly? And because this video is already so long, I need to make a separate video about that specifically. So we'll wrap it here. And then in the next video, you can watch it right here, hopefully in about a week. But just in summary, external evidence, internal evidence, and the arguments against it, there is no good reason to believe that the Apostle John is not the beloved disciple and also is not the evangelist, the author of the fourth gospel. It makes most sense based on all the data that the Apostle John wrote the Gospel of John, and he did it while he was still alive, obviously, because you can't write when you're dead, which pushes the date of when the Gospel of John was written all the way back to around AD 90, maybe AD 100 at the latest. But people want to claim, it wasn't written until AD 120. Not possible. John was still alive. John clearly wrote it. It wasn't written by some community later or anything like that. And so we have all four Gospels written in the first century. The Apostle John could have written even earlier. I'm not getting into the debates about dating, but at the latest, I would say John wrote it in AD 90 or AD 95, something like that. So all four Gospels written in the first century, all based on eyewitness testimony. And that is a wrap for all four Gospels and the arguments for authorship. So next, we're going to go into the Pauline letters, and I'm excited for that. So see y'all then.